Well, hi everybody. I'm Robbie Jones, and you are here with the White Too Long Author Forum. I am proud to have with us Pete Candler. He is the author of, let me hold it up here, this beautiful cover, A Deeper South, The Beauty, Mystery, and Sorrow of the Southern Road. So we're going to have a conversation about the South and white people in the South, and history and memory and a bunch of other themes like that. So we're really happy that you have joined us. If you're just joining, and if you haven't done this the first time, we usually just welcome people in the chat to say where you're checking in from. So if you want to put a little shout out where you are, I've also added a link to buy Pete's book there at Bookshop that you can find in the chat as well. So, well, first of all, let me kind of jump in here and just Pete, hello.
Hey,
Thanks for
how
joining
are you?
us.
Thank you for having me. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah. Well, let me give you a little intro here,
yeah.
and then we'll jump off. So Pete's a little bit of a Renaissance man. He like me was born in Atlanta. We were just chatting beforehand. We found out we were both born at Emory University Hospital, there in Atlanta, Georgia. But he's a writer, photographer. His writings appeared in the LA Times, the LA Review of Books, Commonweal, The Bitter Southerner, one of my favorites, the Christian Century, Chicago Tribune, the Washington Post, and others. He's a graduate of Wake Forest, the University of Cambridge, and a student and former professor of theology. So he's written a lot about memory and forgetfulness, and the legacy of white supremacy in the American South. In addition to the book we're talking about today, A Deeper South, The Beauty, Mystery, and Sorrow of the Southern Road, he's also the author of a photography collection called The Road to Unforgetting, Detours in the American South. So you can find both of those wherever books are sold. He lives currently in Asheville. So he's checking in with us from Asheville today. So, Pete, again, welcome. I'm going to start with just a question I always start off with is, what led you to write the book? A book's a pretty heavy commitment. It's something you have to, spend a lot of years writing and then years living with as the author of this thing out in the world. So, what led you to kind of write this book? It's beautifully written, by the way. It's a page turner. It's a great kind of travel writing. It's great. Kind of again, I'm kind of got some philosophy and theology in there, and just a kind of honest reckoning with his own history, part memoir as well. So, with that, jump in. What led you to put pen to paper?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I mean, as I am really honored to be here and with your audience today. And yeah, so well, the answer is sort of the confluence of a number of different causes or factors led to the writing of this book. It goes back to what seemed like an innocent road trip in 1997 that my friend John Hayes, who's a professor of history now at Augusta University, we were classmates in, well, we're a year apart, but classmates in high school and in college. And in college, we had been reading Flannery O'Connor.
Hmm.
Actually, you may appreciate this sort of convergence, but we were both in a graduate level seminar on Flannery O'Connor and Karl Barth, who is this sort of, gigantic figure in Protestant theology, Swiss, in the 20th century. And so the two of them together, it was like a really heavyweight class. But we were reading a lot of O'Connor. We'd read a little bit before, but they were reading like a version of the South that was very different from the, suburban private school
Hmm.
Atlanta that we had both grown up in. And so jump forward. We did a few trips like that together, and we had three rules. There were no highway, no interstates, no hotels, and no maps. And of course, we were young and foolish, and at the time, and it was actually possible to do. But our first trip, which is a native of the South and of Mississippi, you appreciate the foolishness of this. Our first trip was in August of 1997
Oh man.
after Johnny Cash's final show in Atlanta, and I think one of his last shows ever. And we were driving John's 1977 Ford pickup with no air conditioning and no very little else apart from an engine. And anyway, it was one of those things you do when you're 20, and it seemed fun. And we did like 5 of those trips together, and then took a long pause because life and careers and kids and all that. And well, in 2000, yeah, so the last one was like 2004, then we took a good decade and plus break. Well, in 2017, I was invited to lunch with a friend of mine in Asheville, who's a real historian, not a sort of fake one like me, but he had deep roots in Southern history and the Center for the Study of the American South at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And he said, "Let's have lunch. I wanted to tell you about this book I'm reading." And he said it's called At the Altar of Lynching, and it was about the lynching of Sam Hose, and I've never heard the name Sam Hose in my life, but it sounded like an intense sort of book and something I would was interested in this kind of subject matter at the time. And so I said, yeah, that sounds great. I'd love that. He goes, oh yeah, by the way, your family comes up in it a lot. And suddenly I was slightly less excited about reading the book. And I didn't for a while. We did have a great conversation about it, and I kind of put it to one side for a bit. Um, and in the meantime, I was in Pasadena in early 2018 with a friend of mine called Tom Zellner, who's a fantastic writer from Arizona and one of, great sort of road author. He's written about trains and driving I-10 and all this sort of thing. And he had me out to dinner in Pasadena one night, and we started talking about road trips. And he said, "Well, have you ever done a road trip?" And, like a serious road trip. I was like, "Well, funny you should ask. I've been doing a series of them for a number of years, and we sort of we hadn't done one in a while." And so I told him, the backstory about this. I think I had dabbled in the book about Sam Hose a little bit by then. So I was beginning to learn a little bit more of my family's history that I hadn't been really aware of. But not, I was like not, I was just dipping my toe in it. Anyway, Tom said, "Well, I think you should." And we talked about maybe going back on the road, and like, in 2018, of course, the cultural conversation was very different than it had been the last time we left. We had done a trip together. And so suddenly Confederate monuments were like front page news every day. And we're still seeing, certainly about around 2020, you know, like lynchings still taking place in Georgia, Minnesota. And anyway, Tom said, "Well, I think you should definitely go. I think you should go take another trip. You should go back on the road, and you should definitely write about it." And he said, "If you don't, I'll help you place a piece. And if you don't find, the Atlantic or somebody like that doesn't take it, then I'll publish it in the LA Review of Books, where he's an editor." And of course, it was incredibly generous. I immediately called John, my sort of co-pilot. So, well, we have to go on this trip now because Tom is like promised, like I've got homework. I've got to write an essay now, and I mean it was a great demonstration of confidence in me because Tom had never really read anything I had written, and anyhow, that did lead to an essay in LA Review of Books, and I think it was 2019. And then I knew pretty immediately when after the, Tom's nudging and after the Sam Hose book and then a really consequential trip the to cover the opening of the lynching memorial in Montgomery for the Christian Century. And that was really when it was like, oh, I could no longer avoid this. I knew that it was a book project pretty early, but it became very personal. pretty quickly because suddenly, basically, the story is I was in Montgomery to write this piece for the Christian Century, and in classic Pete ADHD fashion, I got there the day that it was closed, which was, Tuesday. To be fair, it's a weird day to close. But anyway, it was closed, and so I didn't go to the memorial that day, but I went to the bookshop and I picked up a copy of At the Hands of Persons Unknown, which is fit by Philip Dray. It's basically the standard account of the lynching of African Americans in the United States from about 1880 to 1940-ish. And the very first page is the Sam Hose story. And then the next page is Governor Allen Daniel Candler, pro-lynching governor of Georgia from 1898 to 1902. And I'm like, what? I
Mm,
mean, I knew that, like, there was something going on with the family history here, but I suddenly was like, here I am, like, at this sort of monumental book about this subject matter, and my family name is like on page two.
mm.
So that's maybe a long-winded answer, but it became one of those things. It was not really an option, it was just like this is something I had to write.
Yeah. And so in the family history, as you grew up hearing, stories of your family is fairly prominent in Georgia history, right? So there's all kinds of family lore, and you write about that in the book. But like, really, how jarring was that? How hidden was it? Completely hidden, or were there fake echoes or sort of faint echoes of it? That were kind of back there, or was it just completely under wraps, like that piece of the family history?
It was completely under wraps. I mean, completely. And I had, um, well, I think this to me became one of the really fascinating parts about the book for me writing it because um, I didn't want to write about my family. I sort of grew up in a culture where that was, you make a better showing with your mouth shut, as my dad still
Mm,
likes to tell me. But it's probably true in some ways. But anyway, you don't draw attention to yourself. You don't talk about your family and all that stuff. And so it was really kind of unnatural in a way at
mm,
first. But no, and so the point was that I think the thing that really fascinated me about this was that what I was learning about my family's history was like public knowledge. Like my friend David
mm,
shared this book with me about by Don Matthews. And I think you mentioned Chip Arnold's book in your work too about Sam Hose, and both of those books together really made a huge impact on me because I'm reading about there are other people who know more about my family history than
mm,
and one of them is actually W.B. Du Bois. So I learned a story about Du Bois about a great great uncle called Milton Candler from Du Bois, Black Reconstruction in America. And then I also learned that Du Bois, who was writing The Souls of Black Folk from Atlanta in early 20th century, I think that came out in 1903. He was in Atlanta. He's a fixture of Atlanta culture and intellectual life for quite a bit. And that he was like conversant with my family members, like
mm.
with the governor, actually, Governor Candler, I've already mentioned. But basically, I grew up knowing like tiny little, uh, you know, thumbnail sketches of each of these people, and really not much more than the governor never registered apart from the fact that he was the source for what little knowledge we did have of family history because he had written this,
Mm,
um, sort of pamphlet about William Candler, who's sort of the patriarch of the Georgia Candlers. And there was all this mythology surrounding him. And maybe this may be a good illustration because this sort of sums up the version of my family's history that I got growing up. And I know most of these people by name necessarily, but I knew about the William. And I had heard In fact, I remember being in an event like a dinner. And we rarely do family reunions and stuff, but my dad and his brothers and sisters, we got together and had a dinner. And there was at one point someone got up and was sort of extolling, you know, the beauty of being Irish and like how much being Irish had shaped our family identity and all of this stuff. And of course, it was beautiful. It was like, who doesn't want to be Irish? Everybody wants to be Irish, you know, especially around St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah.
And um, and
At
so
least in the 2000s, you maybe not in the 1920s, you wouldn't have wanted to be
right, right,
Irish,
right,
but
exactly. Nowadays, yeah, but not so much. Maybe 200 years ago,
yeah.
but anyhow, I was like that. You know, something didn't quite feel totally right about that, but it sounded charming, and I'm like, okay, cool, yeah, that's sweet. We're Irish. Well, I later learned, um, actually, partly through the governor, through his historical work, because little side note, I think it was after his tenure as governor, he was in the U.S. House of Representatives. And I don't think he had much to do then. It wasn't like being a congressman now. You know, it was like he had a lot of free time. And he spent most of that free time in the Library of Congress researching family history. Anyway, so I I had absorbed this idea of like the Candler family as being from Ireland, and as you will know, Callanwald, the Fine Arts Center in Decatur, that is one of the Candler family homes, um, that is supposedly named for the ancestral home in Ireland. Well, I come to learn after, you know, in the course of writing this book, like it is true that we did, you know, my branch of the family came to the United States before it was the United States, you know, but came to the New World from Ireland, but we weren't really Irish. So the William who is supposed to have had the ancestral home in Callan, was a soldier in Oliver Cromwell's army. And so he was the worst kind of Irish you could possibly be, which is English. And he was like Cromwellian English. And so whatever manor house he had was basically stolen from some unsuspecting Irish family and, you know, given to him as a reward. So that part of the
Mm.
story is sort of a, you know, and that kind of dynamic was repeating itself over and over again, although maybe with less mythological freight. But yeah, it started to unravel pretty quickly from there.
Yeah. Well, I so appreciate you. You know, I wrestled with some of this in my book, White Too Long, where I kind of tell my own family
Yeah.
story of, we end up in Georgia in 1815 when the first Cherokee are getting pushed off the land and they're handing it out for free to good white folks who will come and be pioneers and homestead, or all these kind of, words that whitewash the violent reality of the literally whitewash the violent reality that was going on there. I want. Do you have a copy of your book with you at
I
hand?
do.
I
I
was wondering
do.
if you might read a section that I found like really compelling, because I want to get to kind of it's where you talk about amnesia and white and forgetfulness on page 13. So kind right in the beginning.
Yeah.
Um, but and maybe like begin on page 12 where I believe history is not a spectator sport, and then into the middle of the next page.
Sure.
Because it's part of where I want to just ask you to comment on that piece about you talk about the importance of peripheral vision and seeing things anew. Sometimes we have to unsee things before we can see it. There's lots of really beautiful writing, and there I could see your visual artist lens coming into play, right, as we were kind of looking at these scenes. But if you wouldn't mind, I'd love for you to kind of read that kind of down to that middle of the next page.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. Um, I believe that history is not a spectator sport. One thing every American has in common with every other American is that insofar as we inhabit the peculiar culture of American life at this late stage, we are inheritors of a certain history. and as agents in the continuation of that history, we all have an obligation to attend to the ways in which we remember it. Many of us daily inhabit an atmosphere that we do not pay regular attention to because it is more marketable or profitable or comfortable or simply easier to concentrate on a readily digestible article of cultural consumption that does not demand a fundamental reorientation of our diet. For centuries, American existence has depended on a certain necessary condition of forgetfulness, such as the fact that, quote, our land was not really ours to begin with, and only a very small minority of people could originally lay claim to belonging to the we that could claim ownership over it. In A Deeper South, I want to offer a view of the region that allows readers to divest themselves of a defensive sense of ownership and instead envelops them in the rich, difficult, and all too human flesh of the region. Maybe it will spare you, reader, from a Grady moment of your own, which is another story. But this book also represents a movement from peripheral vision to directed attention. The arc of this whole project is a series of concentric circles of increasing intensity and focus, or a gradually contracting spiral that tries to see the region widely before seeing my own place within it up close. The widest orbital is national memory. Amnesia is an especially American disease, but in the South, we excel at it if one can excel at a disease. If there is a cure for amnesia, Southerners are especially well trained at repelling it. The South is simply the most highly concentrated example of a condition that is not unique to it. Whether we have taught this habit to the rest of the nation, I am not sure, but we have done a hell of a job perfecting it. The bulk of this book traces the routes across the region by which I have come to unlearn, often against my own will, this ingrained forgetfulness.
Yeah, it's a beautiful passage. So thank you for
Thank you.
giving us that in your own voice. But maybe just talk a little bit more about amnesia, forgetfulness, what we see, what we don't see, what we don't want to see, and particularly in the moment we're in. Like you wrote these words a long time before the moment that we're in, but how do they feel today to you?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so I do feel like the, well, one sort of kind of contextual um, bit that was around the in the air when I was writing some of this book. I'm not sure if it was that particular passage, but there was this conversation, maybe a polite way of putting it, between the 1619 project and the previous Trump administration's attempt to counter that with the 1776 project or something.
Yep.
Can't remember
Yep.
what the noun was there, but and I actually watched the the event in the rotunda of the Library of Congress or state or national capitol, whatever, wherever it was, and I can't believe I subjected myself to that, but I did out of duty to research and so forth. But so this contest about like the way we remember history is absolutely central to whatever it is that we're going through right now. And I'm not even sure how to, I mean, it's such a sort of blitzkrieg of chaos at the moment. But I do think that, and maybe in some explicit ways, the memory, the way we remember who we are, or we would like to remember who we are, is I think at the very center of the political kind of
Yeah.
moment. And that's true maybe more today than it was a few years ago, or a couple years ago, whenever it was I wrote that passage. I think I think in my own case, I one of the reasons I felt like compelled to write this book was because I am from a city that is, you know, I identical with American forgetfulness. I mean, Atlanta has, for all its virtues, it has built a reputation and a career, a prolific career out of, at best, an indifference to, or maybe at worst, a hostility to history. So in a way, like, the whole mythology that sprouted up around Sherman's burning of Atlanta was a gift to the marketing people, which were the same as the politicians, in Atlanta, including my own forebears, who, kind of took this and ran with it because it meant that you don't have you were freed from history. It was, now Atlanta was a place where it sort of, it adopted the phoenix who rises from the ashes as its mascot. And then a mayor in the mid 20th century described Atlanta as the city too busy to hate.
Mm,
And
right.
it's all of this sort of like, we're too busy to, if you really to spend like 5 seconds just unraveling that, it's not hard to discover that if you're too busy to hate, you're too busy to love or to really care
Mm,
about anything worthwhile. So in a way, I came to see Atlanta as like in this way, maybe the most quintessentially American city, because its whole life, its whole identity has been built on a kind of willful forgetfulness. And that was reflected in my education, in my family. I think my family also in many ways contributed to this, has contributed to it, and still does in some ways that have ingrained themselves so deeply into the psyche of my family that it's almost unconscious. Um, yeah, so I think that memory, this is where it kind of veers into, not veers, it just runs headlong into the theological uh, category, because memory is one of those, fundamental aspects of being human. And this is one of the things I learned from Augustine, was that, if in Augustine has lots of different ways of kind of, pointing to the image of the Trinity and the human person. And memory is one of those sort of faculties that he regards as just sort of primordially theological. And it would make sense that I didn't grow up with a strong sense of the importance of memory, theologically or culturally or politically or in any other way, having grown up in Atlanta. But as for like, it's it's not the most, but it's certainly one of the most important qualities of being a whole human being. And that's just Augustine's generic, a well human being, salus is his term for salvation, or being a whole, integral human being, having a healed memory. Um, and so I definitely feel like I approached the subject when I first started writing it with a deeply fractured memory, and that's still true. But at least I feel like I know now that, or at least aspire to a fuller um, sense of both myself, my family, my city, my country. So it makes sense. It makes sense that we would be at war right now, internally, domestically, over our past, because everything is at stake, um, when it comes to who we are, and everything is riding on that. Everything is riding on either an honest, non-defensive memory of the American past, um, and the alternatives are simply insufficient, and they're not very promising for the health of a nation or a person or a city or a book club.
Thank you for that. So let me just remind everybody, I'm going to ask one more question, and then we are going to go to your questions. So if you want to put them in the Q&A box, I think we got one in there now, but please go ahead and put them there, and I'll turn to them in just a minute. So the last question I want to ask here is really about what's at stake for white people in doing this work to kind of learn our own family histories, learn a better history of our own communities, because it's easy, and I hear this a lot, when I'm speaking to folks that like it's there's lots of easy ways to say like what's hard about it, right? It's uncomfortable. It makes us feel bad, perhaps. Maybe makes us feel ashamed of where we come from. But what's at stake? Like, what's on the positive side of like why do it?
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great question. Really great question. I mean, it makes you feel alive for for no other reason. You know, I think that you if you living with secrets and moving through the world with the burden of something you know is not true, is not a way to be a free human being. And I know that, yeah, there is an aversion, a normal human aversion to pain and to discomfort. I think it's maybe, more pronounced now than ever. We sort of, it's almost like we, in certain quarters we feel like entitled not to experience discomfort or pain. I think that's definitely a white thing. But I think one of the things that made this writing this book, I mean, this may sound like a weird word to use, but fun and enjoyable, which again, it probably isn't the right word to use, but made it worthwhile and made it invigorating was the sense of discovery of things that were there all along that, I constantly have this sense over and over again. Where whether it's my own family or some moment of history, I cannot believe that I haven't heard this before. I mean, I cannot believe it's like that sense of newness. I mean, yeah, that's invigorating, but it's also like what's more invigorating than that is letting go of idols, letting go of a false history. If that is uncomfortable, yeah, but it's uncomfortable like running is uncomfortable for me at least. And in those few occasions when I do it long enough to get through the discomfort, to feel a little bit like, okay, this actually is doing something good for me, even though it's painful. That's maybe a trivial example, but I do think maybe I should just read one little passage because
Yeah,
it's
that'd be
a
great.
line that maybe does this better. Um, if I can find it, than I could in shoot. Um, well, I'm not actually sure where it is.
I'm gonna throw one there. There's one about O'Connor on page 34,
Is that
35.
it? 34, 35. Oh,
About
yeah,
Flint.
that's the one.
Yep.
Thank you. That's exactly the one. Yeah,
Yeah,
talk
it's a
about
great passage.
O'Connor. I'm gonna just read that paragraph.
Yeah.
Flannery O'Connor, who's a huge hero of mine, and I mean, we could talk about just her alone, and how she does all of this herself in a way. So anyway, O'Connor's work helped introduce me to a South I had little experience with, but she also introduced me to the idea that hope for oneself, for one's city, for one's nation is only to be found in an honest and often violent confrontation with the past, one's own, one's cities, and one's nations. Mythologies may be soothing and even good for tourism, but they cannot save us. O'Connor showed me that there is no future for any of us without a clear-eyed and unsentimental reckoning with our own complicity in the suffering of others. That there is nothing more terrifying, exciting, and liberating than the unlearning of untruths, the dethroning of the self and its enabling illusions, the freedom of spaces newly opened up where lies once were.
Yeah. Yeah, that's amazing. Well, thank you for that. All right, we're going to turn to some questions. We've got one in the queue here. Let's start, and it says, "I'm descended from 8 generations of enslavers. In addition to the damage this has done to the enslaved, I've been reckoning with the damage it's done to relationships within my white family. I wonder what your experience with that aspect is."
Yeah, so that man, first of all, um, when I did the book launch in Atlanta, back in May, one of the people who was in the audience, said, you know, m one of my ancestors was like the boat captain, of the ship in 1619 that brought the first African slaves over. And I thought, well, you know I've got issues, I've got baggage, and but that's a very heavy burden to carry. And you can understand why it might seem preferable to just bury it, never talk about it. Um, and I will say, like the one question I got from the book tour, every at every stop I made was, what does your family think about all of this?
Mm,
And my answer is still the same. I don't know because they haven't told me. And I think that's just a dynamic that persists. And I think one of the things that I've realized since the book came out is that how deeply some of those pathologies have inscribed themselves on my psyche, on my and they're reflected in lots of different ways that may have nothing to do with race or history or anything like that, but just like as a kind of defensiveness or an inability to a sense of hesitation, a sense of self-preservation or whatever it is. I think those those have all they have landed pretty deeply within me and probably the person who wrote the question too. And I think part of the sort of healing is being able, at the very least, to identify some of those. I think, if white supremacy is, it is a political strategy, sure, it is a cultural program, but it's also a psychology. Like it is a habit of mind, and it is in that sense. Um, that part of that aspect of white supremacy is much more difficult to eradicate than than sort of the structural part of it, which is a hell of a challenge on its own. I mean, that is proving almost seemingly impossible, but the psychological part tends to be less visible, less, and because the human soul is like the most complicated
mm,
thing, created thing there is, or one of them. And so, yeah, I feel like that part of it is, I didn't realize when I wrote the book, like how much work there really is to do for me personally. And I know, and by extension, I know for every other reader, hopefully, who has some kind of similar experience. And for us white people, that's really all of us, whether our ancestors were enslavers or not. We've all inherited that legacy. It's imprinted on us in one way or another.
yeah. I was thinking about my own history here, and my family in Georgia, in South Georgia, in and around Macon, was actually much lower on the socioeconomic scale
Mhm.
than yours was. But even so, like as I look through the history, I think my initial thing was, oh, well, maybe that spared us from
Yeah.
being tied into this kind of enslaver economy. And lo and behold, not the case. In fact, I found out that the same family, I have our family Bible from 1815 that belonged to the Moon family on my mother's side. It's a British name. And as I was doing genealogical research, found this family actually turned out, we'd actually think of them as kind of lower middle class today, right? Not wealthy. In fact, I found their state settlement, and if I translate it to today's dollars, everything they owned uh, came up to about $50,000 in today's money, right? So these are not wealthy people, and yet in their estate settlement, there were four human beings listed in their estate settlement. And when I add up the amount of money that those, it was 70% of their assets were tied up in the ownership of four human beings, right? So all the way up and down the socioeconomic scale. It wasn't just the Gone with the Wind crowd, right? That for this structured, as you said, life, the economy, everyday kind of existence, and psychology, right? All the way through. And so when I think about one of the things I've been trying to kind of wrestle with in my own family is, I have a printout of that estate settlement with these four human beings listed, as property. And
Mhm.
it turns out that estate settlement is made the same year that Bible's printed. So they're both from 1815. And just holding those two things together, you know, I think in many ways is the white American story. And how do we make
Yeah,
sense of that?
that's very powerful. Yeah, I mean, can these two pieces of two documents be resolved or reconciled? I mean, I don't know. No, probably not. But it's like, that sort of tension, and just being able to kind of be caught between those, that is in a way a gift. When you were telling that story, I was reminded of one of the things that just really bowled me over when I was before I was writing this book. I had written a review of Michael Twitty's book, The Cooking Gene, which is um, Michael is an African American. Sh he wouldn't call himself a chef, I think, but he's a culinary historian, and he would reenact. He started out reenacting, or not reenacting, but basically cooking on plantations the way that enslaved cooks would have cooked, and within as close as possible the same ingredients and so forth. And his work in culinary history led him to search for his own story and his own ancestors. And the part about that really just stopped me cold was, he was trying to trace his genealogy through documentation, and thank God, we have so many resources now to be able to do this sort of work. But he only got as far as the bill of sale for an
Mm,
ancestor. And then after that, there was no documentary evidence. And it's just like, the 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 experience of like of like even finding a bit of evidence of an ancestor is a sales receipt
mm,
is just like that's just unfathomable. I mean, I don't, it's just like mind-boggling. And it really shifted for me, like my sense of like, I had taken for granted the fact that my family's history was documented. And a lot of the research that I had did for this book was like, this wasn't coming from like secret arc, some treasure chest in the basement of someone's
mm,
house. It was all in the newspapers and in books and stuff. And so that really became, for me, a kind of working understanding of white privilege was just that the privilege was being able to not really care about one's history and not worry about it because you knew it was out there and it was like, safely written down somewhere, which meant that I never had to worry about it.
yeah. All right, we've got one more question here. Can you comment on seeing whiteness? And yeah, you talk a lot about vision, what we see, what we don't see in the book. So
Seeing whiteness. Um, is there more to that question or like,
that's
oh,
what we've got. I'm wondering if
yeah,
what you say
yeah.
about peripheral vision, in
Yeah.
some ways at the beginning of the book might be a helpful way in here.
Yeah, I mean that's such a well, I think one of the ways this comes up for me is like Black History Month is a good time to maybe think about this. Like what would there is something that constitute there are a lot of somethings that constitute or contribute to the Black American experience, and that is so multi-layered, and it's not one non-monolithic, but it like Black history is a recognizable thing in the way that white history is, but is not. I mean, when you talk about like Black culture, in an American sense, like the Black experience. I know again that's an abstraction, but like whiteness or white culture doesn't exist in the same way. I mean, it's not a thing um, in the same fashion. And um, I know this is terribly abstract. See if I can make this sort of land somewhere. But I think one of the things about, I mean, whiteness is an invention in the same way that race is an invention of the modern West. Um, and but I think the weird thing about whiteness is that white people invented racial categories for everybody else, um, except ourselves. I mean, we created this idea of like whiteness being uniquely given of God, and there's so many, you talk about so many different sort of dimensions of that and instances of the way in which white supremacy has manifested itself as a kind of divine right almost. But as a culture, it's like, I mean, we might say there is like white music, but it's it's a kind of it's a certain kind of homelessness. I think that's maybe one way to put it, is that whiteness means in this sense of the kind of modern conception of racialization, it means to be homeless. And I think that was understood as a liberating quality, like the same way that being freed from history was seen for Atlanta as like, oh, this is a great boon, this is a great advantage and gift. And to be homeless and to belong to no place is one feature of whiteness, I think. But it's one of the saddest parts of it. To belong to no place is one of those things that I think has come to characterize, if we could talk about sort of whiteness in America or white culture, if that's a thing, that made it, for example, so difficult for white people to understand when Katrina hit New Orleans and there were Black families in the lower Ninth Ward who wanted to rebuild their homes. I mean, it was like the sense of attachment to a place that has in many ways caused a lot of grief, caused a lot of sorrow and pain. And yet, that sense of belonging, for better or worse, to a place or to a people, that is that is not a characteristic of whiteness, I think.
Mm. Yeah. I was just thinking of one other passage. This is on page 343, toward the end of the book. You write, white privilege means there are stories you do not have to be burdened by, neighborhoods of the imagination you think you can casually avoid without damage to your soul. My life as a white person could have turned out differently if I had learned to inhabit a different narrative geography to be shaped by the practice of alienating mental spaces, but I didn't have to. So very close
Mm.
to what you're saying there. Yeah.
Thank
Um,
you. Yeah.
well, great. We're close to time. I don't think we've got any other questions here, but thank you so much for your time. Is there any other thoughts you want to just leave us with on our way out here, Pete?
Oh man. Gosh. Well, I'm just delighted to be here and to be talking with you, and to the invisible audience out there. Thank you, and thank you to the invisible audience, like each of you, for being here. I'm really grateful you showed up. And I feel like this is, I mean, we have a lot more to talk about, I'm sure. And this is, we just begun to scratch the surface. Um, yeah, it is always sort of a temptation or an urge, maybe it's a human need to end on kind of a positive note, but I think most of my work tries to avoid doing that and tries to avoid leaving um, leaving us on with some sort of resolution, some sort of positive. Not because I sort of enjoy seeing people suffer, but because I think it's important for us, white people in particular, to not have that resolution for a little bit, to sit with that sense of conflict or the sense of the difficult view staring us back in the mirror, and that discomfort. I feel like that's important, and ultimately it ultimately is really good. And it ultimately feels much better than deceit.
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote a piece a while back that I called "The Sacred Gift of White Discomfort,"
Mm,
along these lines, which I think is that's been my experience of it actually. I mean, there's all these, ridiculous bills being introduced that are like white people can't be uncomfortable and we don't want to make white children uncomfortable. But
yeah.
as you said, I mean, you can't live life and you can't grow, right, without some discomfort. I mean, I think your analogy about running is a good one. I mean, we experience discomfort in order to grow, right? And that's really what's at stake here. And so I won't tie it all up in a bow, but I will say that I think my own work, and it's evident in your book here, that there is joy and liberation and hope on the other side of this work, which I so appreciate you holding up for us. So the book is A Deeper South. And it is the beauty, mystery, and sorrow of the Southern Road. There's all kinds of, I mean, it is great because he takes you through the South. So we've been talking kind of up here, but there are all these on the ground, very detailed scenes from Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, Mississippi. And so if you're from any of those places, you will recognize, but you'll also recognize it, but you'll also get Pete's lens on it, which I think often reveals some depth to places, some places I'd been and now know more things about than I did when I started it. So thank you all for being here for the White Too Long Author Forum, and thank you, Pete Candler, and buy the book, A Deeper South. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Robbie.